Mr. H once again. Now let's talk about if I'm using service information to actually do a job. Now what? Well, I'll show you. Okay, so next thing, I showed you guys how to deal with an RO, how to fill out, how to do the estimate, how to relay information to a customer. Now let's talk a little bit more about how to use the software to my advantage and how do I do a job correctly. As far as what tools do I need, how long do I have to do it? We've already covered that. It's going to be 11 hours. And also, what order do I have to do these things in? You know, torque specs, things like that. Things inquiring minds would like to know. So let's find out. Let's find out here. So here's where I'm at right now. So I have the job, and then I have this list that's along the side. So just in case the computer doesn't make it out, I've got applications, exploded diagram view, parts and labor, which we already found out was 11 hours. And then here's the big one that we want to know. Actually, these two. So overhaul, removal and replacement, and then mechanical specifications. So like torque specs and everything like that. So if I'm trying to find out what I torque everything to, how tight all the bolts and stuff to be, I can go straight to torque specifications. But we're interested in how do I take this thing apart? That's always the age-old question. So here's what I'm going to do. I selected that, and oh boy, it's loading there. Maybe there's a lot of steps. I don't know yet. Fascinating. It's almost like real life. Well, we'll give that a second to decide if it wants to work or not. So what you're basically going to do is you don't wait till you're part way into a job to find out the directions on how to do it. The good way to go about this is usually I actually look up what it takes to do a job before I even call the customer, because that can kind of throw a wrench into the works if it's something that's going to take longer than a day, if the lift that I'm using is going to be tied up. There's a whole bunch of things I got to take into account when I'm doing a job. So I can't say, give a customer an estimate, yeah, it's going to be A, B, and C, and then I find out, oh, I need the special tool. Oh, I need this special lift, or, you know, the parts are going to be 5 days out. And meanwhile, I have the car torn apart, and I said the customer, it'll be done tomorrow. I got to make sure I think about everything before I do this. So what I do before I even call the customer, I've already confirmed what's wrong with the car. I know what route I have to take. I'm going to look at the actual directions. What's it going to take to get this job done with specifications and instruction? I go through that before I even touch the car, before I even call the customer. I'm going to look at what does it take to do this job. So what I'm looking at now, it finally loaded, is I'm going to look on this screen and I have components that are involved. I have removal and installation. Well, we're removing, we're not installing yet. So I click on removal, and what it's going to do is it's going to load up all the steps I need to take in order to remove this cylinder head off this Toyota. So here's what I got. So hopefully you can see that. Here's all the steps. First step, discharge fuel system pressure, disconnect cables from negative battery terminal, place front wheels facing straight ahead, remove the front wheels, and if we keep going on, you know, drain oil, drain coolant, drain transaxle fluid, because it's front wheel drive, so it has a transaxle, drain brake fluid. Man, this is getting pretty involved. Okay, remove these panels, and notice they give you diagrams as well, and it'll go on and on how to remove certain parts. And there's a lot to this job. So you could see as I'm scrolling, there's a lot of things that you need to disconnect. That's why I say it's okay to have your cameras on you, because in the shop, I'd be taking pictures. Just in case there's not a diagram showing me of how something came apart or went back together, I take pictures. So, and look at this, I could scroll on forever and ever. Some of these are very, very lengthy. Some of them even have hints. So they say use the same procedures described for the left-hand side. So it looks like for this guy, you're actually taking the whole engine out is what it's looking like. So yeah, you're dropping the whole subframe. So that should sound familiar. The whole subframe or cradle just to do this engine job. But yeah, look at that. Makes sense why it takes 11 hours to do the whole thing now. If it's your first time around, it might take more than that. But look, now we got special tools involved. So there's just a little bit of what you might do. And just because now knowing that, I can actually walk into wherever the phone is, and when I talk to the customer, I can tell them, hey, this is probably going to be a 2-day job because I'm going to tie up a lift. I got to drop the whole cradle out, and ooh, hang on. I got to go back to where that 11 hours came into play. Because what does that all entail? It just said 11 hours. But if I'm removing all that front suspension, the cradle and all that, you know what I might have to do when everything's all said and done? I might have to do an alignment. Because that's part of the chassis. I just removed all that suspension. When I put it back together, things might not be lined up the way they were before. So there's something that I didn't even take into account cost-wise. So we had that, that $1,700. Okay, well now I got let's say $90 for an alignment. I have to add that in there. So, another $100. What if some of the cradle bolts don't come loose, or if I have rust issues, things like that. The only thing that was in my mind was I got to take the head off an engine. I wasn't even thinking about suspension or brakes, but that's the stuff that you got to take into account when you're making these repair orders and when you're calling the customer to let them know what's going on. If I totally forgot about that and I didn't mention to the customer, it's going to be really hard to explain why I charged them an extra $100. Now, keep in mind it's an estimate. You should leave that open-ended, but you're trying to stick as close as you can to the estimate. So those are some things that you got to kind of think about ahead of time, and that's why it's always good I go through this stuff before I get the okay from the customer so I can kind of think about what route I'm going to take with a job. If it's a really straightforward job, hey, your wheel's out of balance, obviously I don't have to sit there and overthink overthink until my head explodes. But when it's bigger jobs like this, always go through the directions before you make that phone call or before you sell the job, because it might be a little more than you bargained for, and there might be things you didn't think about until you're partway into a job. And that sucks when you have to make a phone call to a customer because you didn't do your research or you didn't see something coming, and now you got to make changes to what the original estimate was and when the car's getting done and things like that. So let's go back. Now we just looked at the removal. Installation will usually be the opposite of the directions you just did, except for, use this new gasket, put this sealant on here. They'll say different things. They'll say, don't use the same bolts for these things because the bolts stretch, always use different bolts. They'll say things along those lines. But let's go back. Way back. Now I'm going to click on specifications. So let's find out the specs. Let's find out specs for this guy. Okay, so I got a couple of options. They gave me service data, torque specs, and component tightening specs and sequences. So not only am I torquing things to spec, but there might be an order or a sequence I have to torque certain things in. So like a cylinder head, you're going to have a pattern that you might have to torque the head bolts in. Because if you do just, I'll torque these first 3 bolts down to 100 foot-pounds, you actually might warp the head. You might do a couple of things that might damage the head gasket. There's a lot that goes into it. So let's just click on torque specs. Let's see what we get. All right, oh yeah. I'm going to open this tab up. You guys are going to like this. Torque specs. Torque specs everywhere. So let's take a look at the torque specs, shall we? Okay, this is just one page. There's like 5 pages, maybe 6 pages worth. But there is all sorts of torque specs. So engine mount brackets, engine removing rod brackets, all these cylinder head brackets. Look, this whole page is just mainly covers and brackets. But it says off to the right-hand side, the NM means Newton meters. The other one is KFG for centimeters. And the other one is what we would use, foot-pounds. So this last section here is what you guys would normally use, is foot-pounds and inch-pounds. So if you're ever just trying to figure out what the torque specs are for a certain job, or you want to jot them down on the RO so you're not running back and forth for service information as you're doing the job, that's what I do. Not run back and forth. I usually make the list. I'll print it out and I'll have it right next to me on the job so it saves me from walking back and forth. Time's money. So those are all my torque specs. That's everything. Remember what I said. That's just one page. There's tons of pages here. So I'm scrolling down a whole bunch. Even the oil filter has a torque spec. Yeah, it does. Now going through, let's see, component ID. Nothing really to show there. It just shows you where the VIN numbers would be on some of the parts, like transmission, engine, things like that. I'm just going through anything that might help you here. But yeah, there's quite a few things to mess around with on all data. I think all data is probably one of the friendliest because it's very much organized on what to find things with. But that's a little bit into using all data, just showing you a little bit about it and how I would go about trying to get a car ready for a job, or making sure I fill out an RO properly, or looking at the sequence and procedures that I need to use for a job.